I was 5 years old when my mother looked straight into my eyes, told me to wait just 1 minute, and then walked out of my life forever. Through the heavy, smudge-covered glass doors of the shopping mall, I watched my parents walk away. There was no hesitation in their steps, no frantic backward glances to ensure I was safe. They left me behind with the casual, breathtaking indifference of people discarding something they simply couldn't be bothered to carry anymore. My name is Evangeline Bennett. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. That bitter winter morning began like any other ordinary, unremarkable weekend in our cramped apartment. The frost had painted thick, icy ferns across the bedroom windows, and the radiators clanked with a hollow, metallic rhythm. My mother, Anastasia, had woken me up earlier than usual. Her voice, normally edged with exhaustion and a simmering, unexplainable resentment toward me, was uncharacteristically light. She told me we were going to the mall. I remember the rush of pure, innocent excitement that flooded my tiny chest. We rarely went anywhere as a family. Excursions were considered an expense and an inconvenience. I quickly scrambled out of bed and pulled on my favorite winter coat, a vibrant purple parka with a broken zipper that always snagged halfway up, leaving my neck exposed to the chill. I grabbed my stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hoppy. He was missing a button eye from being dragged across hardwood floors, and his remaining eye always seemed to look at me with a quiet, knowing comfort. My father, Reginald, barely acknowledged my existence as we climbed into our rusting sedan. He sat behind the wheel, his large hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles shone stark white against his skin. He smelled of stale tobacco and bitter, burnt coffee. He was a man who seemed permanently inconvenienced by the world, but especially by me. Every breath I took, every question I asked seemed to add to an invisible ledger of debts I owed him. The drive was suffocatingly silent. The radio was off. No one spoke. I pressed my face against the frozen window, watching the snow-dusted streets and barren trees blur past, my mind buzzing with the vibrant imagination of a 5-year-old. I imagined the towering displays of toys, the sparkling holiday lights draped across the ceilings, the scent of cinnamon pretzels drifting through the air. To a child whose world was confined to quiet corners and hushed reprimands, a trip to the mall was a universe of endless, glittering possibilities. When we finally arrived, the mall was a chaotic, beautiful sea of holiday shoppers. Bright, blinding lights illuminated the concourse, and the overwhelming, echoing hum of thousands of voices washed over me. Anastasia gripped my small hand in hers. Her hold wasn't protective. It was a vice grip, pulling me forward. She walked far too fast for my little legs to comfortably keep up, practically dragging me past the glowing storefronts. Reginald trailed slightly behind us. When I dared to glance back over my shoulder, I didn't see a father watching over his family. I saw a man with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes nervously scanning the exit signs rather than the window displays. Eventually, we stopped in the very heart of the toy department of a massive anchor store. It was a canyon of plastic joy, shelves stacked to the ceiling with brightly colored boxes, action figures, board games, and plush animals towered over me. It was everything I had dreamed of in the car. Anastasia let go of my hand. She knelt down on the scuffed linoleum floor so that we were perfectly face to face. For a fleeting, desperate second, I thought she might smile at me. I thought she might ask me which toy I wanted for the holidays. Instead, her hands reached out and meticulously folded the collar of my purple coat, trying to cover my exposed neck. It was such a strangely delicate, maternal gesture for a woman who was about to commit an act of absolute, calculated cruelty. I can still smell her perfume, a sharp, synthetic floral scent that to this day makes my stomach turn. "Stay right here, sweetie," she said. Her voice was perfectly smooth, not a single tremor, not a single crack of emotion. "Mommy needs to use the restroom. I'll be back in 1 minute. Count to 60. "Okay," I chirped, smiling brightly, clutching Mr. Hoppy tightly against my chest. Counting to 60 was my newest, proudest academic achievement. I couldn't wait to show her how flawlessly I could do it. She stood up, gave Reginald a single, hard, impenetrable look, and walked away. I watched her beige trench coat weave through a group of teenagers and blend into the dense crowd. Reginald didn't even look at me. He just turned on his heel and followed her. And then, standing perfectly still in the shadow of a towering display of board games, I began to count. 1, 2, 3. Shoppers rushed past me, their heavy winter coats brushing against my shoulders like water parting around a small stone in a river. 14, 15, 16. I counted slowly, deliberately, sounding out each syllable in my head. I was terrified that if I messed up the rules, if I skipped a number, she would be angry when she returned. 58, 59, 60. I stopped. I stood on my tiptoes, peering down the long, brightly lit aisle. I waited for her familiar trench coat to turn the corner. Nothing. Just a sea of strangers carrying shopping bags. Thinking I must have counted far too fast, that my childish perception of time was flawed, I decided to start over. I wanted to be good. I wanted to be obedient. So I counted to 60 a second time, then a third, then a fourth. The bright fluorescent lights above began to feel harsh, burning into my eyes. The joyful, upbeat holiday music echoing from the mall's overhead speakers morphed into a mocking, terrifying noise. My little legs started to ache from standing locked in the exact same position, terrified to move an inch off the imaginary X on the floor. 10 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. Children ran past me holding their parents' hands. I saw a little girl my age crying because she dropped her lollipop, and her father immediately swept her up into his arms, kissing her forehead to soothe her. Everyone had someone to anchor them to the world. I had no one. The realization didn't hit me all at once. It seeped into my bones like the winter chill. The cold, heavy truth that the 1 minute was never going to end. Eventually, an elderly mall security guard named Thomas Whitaker noticed the small girl shivering in a purple coat, frozen like a statue in the toy aisle. He had walked his route twice and seen me standing in the exact same spot. He knelt beside me, the walkie-talkie on his belt crackling softly. His eyes crinkled with deep, immediate concern. "Hey there, little one," he said gently. "Are you lost? Where are your mom and dad?" I couldn't speak. My throat was constricted by a terror so profound I didn't have the vocabulary to explain it. I just squeezed my stuffed rabbit until my tiny knuckles ached, a single tear sliding down my cheek. Thomas didn't push. He took off his heavy uniform jacket, draped it over my trembling shoulders, and led me to the back security office. It was a cramped, windowless room with cinder block walls painted a dull gray, filled with the harsh static of security monitors and uncomfortable plastic chairs. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn until I was an adult reviewing the legal files of my own life, was that the mall's security cameras had already captured the brutal truth of that afternoon. The grainy, black and white footage showed Anastasia and Reginald leaving the toy aisle and walking straight toward the main exit. They didn't stop at the restrooms. They didn't pause to browse. They marched with the synchronized determination of inmates staging a breakout. The cameras even captured a moment in the parking lot. A female mall employee, noticing them leaving without the child they had walked in with, approached them near their rusting sedan. Even without audio, the body language was damning. She pointed back toward the building, clearly asking if they had forgotten a little girl inside. The camera caught Reginald waving the employee off with a dismissive, irritated flick of his wrist. It caught Anastasia shaking her head firmly. "No, no one is with us. You're mistaken." And then they climbed into their car, the exhaust pluming in the freezing air, and drove away. It wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't a crowded mall separation where parents lose their minds in panic. It was a calculated execution of a plan. They had meticulously discarded me, bribed their consciences with a lie to a stranger, and simply erased me from their lives. I sat in that bleak security office as the sky outside turned black. The silence of the room was broken only by the ticking of a wall clock and the hushed, horrified whispers of the local police officers who had arrived to take my statement. I watched their faces fall as the hours dragged on. I watched them realize, with a sickening, sinking feeling, that the phones at the precinct weren't ringing. No missing child report was going to be filed. No frantic mother was going to burst through the doors. I pulled my knees to my chest, burying my face in my rabbit's soft ears, wishing I could disappear into the gray cinder block walls. And then, the heavy metal door of the security office creaked open, and a stranger walked in. He was a man in his mid-50s, wearing a simple, worn, gray knit sweater. He had been sitting in the mall's small cafe just outside the security perimeter, quietly watching the commotion, piecing together the tragedy unfolding behind the glass. He didn't look at me with the suffocating, tragic pity the police officers had. He looked at me with a profound, quiet, piercing understanding. He spoke briefly to Thomas Whitaker, showing some identification, before slowly walking over to the plastic chair across from me. He sat down, ensuring he was lower than my eye level so he wouldn't tower over me. In his large, calloused hands, he held a steaming paper cup. He set it gently on the table between us. "Hot chocolate," he said softly. His voice was a rich, steady baritone. It felt like a warm, heavy blanket being wrapped around my shivering soul. He didn't ask me for my name. He didn't ask me what my parents looked like. "My name is Arthur," he said, keeping his hands neatly folded in his lap so I wouldn't feel threatened. When I was a little boy, about your age, I lived in an orphanage. It was a very big building. It was crowded and loud, and there were people everywhere. He paused, his kind eyes locking onto mine, seeing straight through the purple coat and the tears. But even with all those people around, Arthur continued gently, I felt completely invisible. I know exactly what it feels like to be in a room full of people, and know deep down in your bones that none of them are looking for you. For the first time all day, I lifted my head from my knees. I looked at the stranger, and for the first time in my short 5 years of life, I felt truly seen. He didn't ask me for my story. He simply offered me a safe harbor in the storm my parents had left me to drown in. That night, after rigorous background checks, emergency social worker interventions, and hours of police deliberation, Arthur Bennett, a man with absolutely no blood obligation to me whatsoever, offered to take me in as an emergency, temporary foster placement so I wouldn't have to sleep in a sterile county facility. He reached out his hand, and I took it. We walked out of the mall together, leaving the ghost of the little girl who counted to 60 behind in the toy aisle. What neither of us knew that night was that the temporary placement would forge a bond thicker than any bloodline. And what I couldn't have possibly comprehended was that 31 years later, the people who walked out of those glass doors would come back. Not to apologize, but to try and destroy the beautiful, fortified life Arthur and I were about to build. That temporary emergency placement did not remain temporary for long. Within a year, after the state exhausted every avenue to locate the people who had so meticulously erased their tracks, Arthur Bennett legally adopted me. He didn't just give me his last name, he gave me a sanctuary. Arthur never tried to magically erase the trauma of that winter day at the mall. He was a quiet, observant man who understood that healing a broken child doesn't happen with grand, sweeping gestures or expensive toys. It happens in the mundane, quiet consistency of everyday life. It happened when he left the hallway light on every single night because he knew the dark terrified me. It happened when he never once raised his voice, even when I accidentally shattered his favorite coffee mug. It happened when he sat beside my bed during night terrors, his large, calloused hand holding mine, promising over and over, I'm right here, Evangeline. I'm not going anywhere. And through his relentless, unconditional love, the terrified 5-year-old girl who counted to 60 in the toy aisle slowly began to breathe again. Arthur taught me that family is not defined by biology, it is defined by choice. And he chose me, every single day, for 31 years. Because of him, I didn't let the profound injustice of my early life destroy me. Instead, I weaponized it into a blazing academic drive. By the time I was 36, I was sitting behind the heavy oak bench of the civil courts as a magistrate judge. I spent my days looking down at broken families, neglected children, and victims of a flawed system, standing as a fierce barrier between the vulnerable and the cruel. I built a life of order, unwavering justice, and profound gratitude. Arthur remained my anchor. Every Sunday, without fail, I drove to his modest, slightly drafty house. We cooked together, debated the news, and tended to his small garden. He was my compass, my confidant, my entire family. But the universe, in its cruelest irony, rarely lets us keep our saviors forever. During a remarkably cold, lingering spring, the vibrant energy that had always defined Arthur began to fade. At first, he blamed it on the changing seasons, brushing off his fatigue with a gentle smile and a wave of his hand. But the weight loss became impossible to hide, and the grim reality eventually came to light: terminal cancer. Even in his darkest hours, Arthur's only concern was me. He fought the disease with a quiet, stoic dignity, hiding the worst of his pain. I later realized why he downplayed his suffering. He knew my deepest, most primal trigger was the fear of abandonment. He knew that watching him slip away would inevitably drag me back to the feeling of being left behind. So, he bore the excruciating agony of his failing body largely in silence, trying to protect me from the grief of his departure for as long as he humanly could. When the end finally came, it was peaceful. I sat beside his bed in a quiet hospice room, the only sound the rhythmic, shallow draw of his breathing. I held his hand, the same hand that had offered me a cup of hot chocolate 31 years prior. "You saved my life, Dad," I whispered, the tears falling freely onto his papery skin. "You gave me everything." He opened his eyes one last time. They were clouded, but the profound, piercing love in them remained entirely intact. He squeezed my fingers with the last ounce of his strength, and then he let go. I buried the only father I ever truly knew on a damp, overcast Tuesday. It was a modest, private ceremony attended by close colleagues from the courthouse and a few of his old friends. As the groundskeepers prepared to lower the casket into the earth, I stepped forward. From my coat pocket, I pulled out Mr. Hoppy, the worn, one-eyed stuffed rabbit I had clung to on the worst day of my life. Arthur had saved the little girl who held that rabbit. He had protected us both. It only felt right that Mr. Hoppy went with him, to keep him company in the dark, just as Arthur had kept me company in mine. I placed the rabbit gently on the polished wood, whispered a final goodbye, and watched my entire world descend into the ground. For a month, I walked through life in a suffocating haze of grief. The courthouse provided a rigid structure that kept me from entirely falling apart, but the silence of my own home in the evenings was deafening. Then I received a phone call from Harrison Sterling, Arthur's longtime attorney and one of the few people who had known him since his youth. Harrison asked me to come to his office for the formal reading of the will. I expected nothing more than the paperwork for Arthur's modest two-bedroom home, his aging sedan, and perhaps a small savings account. Arthur had always lived like a man who clipped grocery coupons and repaired his own shoes. He drove the speed limit, bought his clothes on sale, and never flaunted a dime. I sat in Harrison's heavy leather chair, the scent of mahogany and old paper filling the room, completely unprepared for the staggering reality of the man who raised me. Arthur was an incredibly private man, Evangeline, Harrison began, peering at me over the rim of his reading glasses. He lived quietly by design, not by necessity. In the early 1980s, before the tech boom was even a whisper in the public ear, Arthur was a silent angel investor. He provided the seed money for several technology startups that eventually became the foundational backbone of modern computer networking. I stared at Harrison, my brow furrowing in confusion. Arthur? My Arthur? The man who spent 3 hours trying to fix a leaky faucet last month rather than call a plumber? Harrison smiled softly, a look of deep fondness washing over his seasoned face. Yes, that Arthur. He never flaunted his wealth because he despised what money did to people. And when he brought you home, he made a conscious decision to keep it entirely hidden. He wanted you to grow up grounded. He wanted you to understand the value of hard work, of empathy, of earning your place in the world. He knew that if you grew up as an heiress, it might distort the beautiful, resilient person you were meant to become. Harrison reached across the wide desk and slid a thick, heavily bound legal document toward me. Arthur's total estate, Harrison said, his voice steady but carrying immense weight, is valued at just over $40 million. The breath completely left my lungs. The room seemed to tilt. 40 million. The vast majority of the estate, Harrison continued, opening the folder, has been placed into permanent, self-sustaining endowments for children's charities, pediatric medical research, and specifically, initiatives dedicated to foster care reform. He wanted to help the children who are still sitting in the proverbial toy aisle, waiting to be found. Tears pricked my eyes. Even in death, his heart was boundlessly generous. But to you, Evangeline, his beloved daughter, Harrison said, his tone softening, he left a specific, highly protected trust in the amount of $4 million. He left a letter for you as well. Harrison handed me a sealed envelope. I opened it with trembling fingers. Arthur's familiar, steady handwriting stared back at me. My dearest Evangeline, I leave this to you not as a crutch, but as a shield. Use it to build the life you so deeply deserve, entirely insulated from the cruelty of your beginnings. You owe the world nothing, but you have already given it so much. I could not be prouder of the woman you are. Love, Dad. Because of the sheer, staggering size of the charitable donations, the execution of the will had to be filed in probate court. It instantly became public record, and in a slow news week, it didn't take long for local journalists to catch the scent of what they deemed the ultimate heartwarming human interest story. Local magistrate judge inherits millions from reclusive adoptive father who rescued her from mall abandonment 31 years ago. The headlines practically wrote themselves. My face, alongside an old, candid photograph of Arthur and me at my law school graduation, flashed across evening television broadcasts and morning newspaper front pages. Colleagues offered their awe and condolences. Strangers smiled at me in the grocery store. I absolutely hated the attention. I hated that my deepest trauma and my deepest loss were being consumed as evening entertainment. But I told myself it would blow over. In a week or two, the news cycle would move on to the next sensation, and I would be left in peace to grieve my father and figure out how to navigate my new reality. I was so incredibly, dangerously wrong. The broadcast didn't just reach the well-wishers and the gossips of my city. The signal traveled much further. It reached the dark, forgotten corners of my past. It reached the people who had erased me. 3 weeks after the news broke, a heavy, unseasonal rain battered the windows of my home. I had just returned from a grueling day at the courthouse, shedding my wet coat and craving nothing more than a hot shower and a quiet evening. Then, the doorbell rang. I frowned, looking through the peephole. A man in a beige raincoat stood on my porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He held a thick manila envelope against his chest to protect it from the damp air. Assuming it was a courier with late case files from the clerk's office, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. "Evangeline Bennett?" the man asked. His tone was entirely practiced, devoid of any real curiosity. "Yes, that's me." He thrust the heavy envelope into my hands, turned on his heel, and walked back out into the rain. "You've been served," he called over his shoulder. My heart hammered a sudden, erratic rhythm against my ribs as I closed the door. I am a judge. I know exactly what legal filings look like, how they feel in your hands. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the words printed in bold black ink at the top of the complaint. Plaintiffs: Reginald Kingsley and Anastasia Kingsley. The hallway began to spin. My knees went weak, and I had to lean heavily against the console table to keep from collapsing. 31 years. 31 years of absolute deafening silence. Not a single birthday card. Not a single phone call. Not a single fleeting inquiry to the police to find out if the 5-year-old girl they left in the toy aisle was dead or alive. And now, their names were on a piece of paper in my home. I forced my eyes to read the first page of the massive document, bile rising in the back of my throat. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction. Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley were filing an emergency injunction to freeze Arthur Bennett's estate. They were suing me for the $4 million. They alleged wrongful adoption, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and parental alienation. In their twisted, sickening narrative crafted by their attorneys, they hadn't abandoned me. They claimed they had merely been separated from me in the chaos of a crowded holiday mall. They claimed they had frantically searched the building only to find that Arthur Bennett had opportunistically abducted their confused child right out from under them. They painted themselves as grieving, devastated parents who had spent 3 decades weeping for their stolen daughter, victims of a flawed, corrupt legal system that had handed their flesh and blood over to a wealthy stranger. They wanted it all: the money, the public sympathy, and the absolute destruction of Arthur Bennett's name. The audacity was so immense it made me physically sick. I slid down the wall, sitting on the hardwood floor, clutching the lawsuit to my chest as a tidal wave of panic and the phantom terror of a 5-year-old washed over me. But as I sat there in the quiet of my hallway, staring at the names of the monsters who had created me, the panic slowly began to recede. Beneath the nausea, a cold, sharp, unyielding fury began to ignite in my veins. They thought I was still that powerless little girl standing in the toy aisle, counting to 60, waiting to be victimized. They thought they could bully me with a lawsuit and a threat of public scandal into handing over Arthur's money just to make them go away. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who spent her life dissecting lies in a courtroom. They wanted a fight, and I was going to give them a massacre. The morning after the process server stood on my porch, I didn't go to the courthouse. I didn't put on my judicial robes. Instead, I drove straight to the gleaming downtown offices of Harrison Sterling. I carried the 40-page lawsuit in my hands, its edges already crumpled from how tightly I had gripped it through a sleepless night. I marched past Harrison's receptionist and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to his office. He was already sitting at his desk, a cup of black coffee steaming beside a pristine legal pad. He took one look at my face, pale and rigid with barely contained fury, and then he looked at the manila envelope in my hand. "They served you," Harrison said quietly. It wasn't a question. I threw the thick stack of papers onto his desk. "They're claiming Arthur abducted me. They're asking the court to freeze the entire estate, demanding the $4 million for emotional anguish, and threatening to take this to the press if I don't agree to a quiet, immediate settlement. They think they can extort me, Harrison. They think because I am a judge, I will pay them to go away just to protect my reputation." I leaned over his desk, my voice dropping to a trembling, dangerous whisper. "I will never settle with them. Not for a single dime. I want to fight this. I want to tear their lies apart in open court, even if it costs me every penny Arthur left me to do it." Harrison didn't look worried. He didn't offer me a sympathetic smile or counsel me on the risks of public exposure. Instead, a slow, deeply satisfying smile spread across his seasoned face. He reached out and tapped his index finger against the lawsuit. "I was hoping you'd say that, Evangeline," Harrison murmured. He stood up, walked over to a secure filing cabinet in the corner of his office, and unlocked it with a key from his pocket. He pulled out a thick, red banded file bearing Arthur's personal crest and laid it gently on the desk between us. "Arthur was a brilliant man," Harrison said, his eyes gleaming with the ghost of Arthur's protective genius. "He knew human nature, and he knew exactly the kind of people Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley were. He always suspected that if you ever became successful, or if significant money ever entered the picture, they would crawl out of the woodwork to claim you." I stared at the red file, my breath catching in my throat. "What is that?" "When Arthur set up your $4 million trust, he didn't just leave you money. He left you a weapon," Harrison explained, leaning forward. "He embedded a poison pill clause specifically triggered by Reginald and Anastasia. If anyone claiming to be your biological family ever initiated legal action to contest this estate, the trust automatically unlocks a separate, unrestricted legal and investigative defense fund." Harrison's smile widened into something almost predatory. "It isn't just money to defend you in court, Evangeline. It's a blank check to completely dissect their lives. Arthur gave us the resources to dig up every dark secret, every financial crime, and every lie they've told for the last 31 years. They think they set a trap for you, but Arthur set a trap for them, and they just walked right into it." By noon that same day, Harrison had transformed his largest conference room into a war room. The first person he brought in was Eleanor Vance, a premier forensic accountant who spent her career untangling hidden assets, embezzlement schemes, and financial fraud for the federal courts. Eleanor was a woman of few words, sharp tailored suits, and an absolutely lethal eye for numbers. For a week, the walls of the conference room filled with timelines, bank statements, tax records, and court filings. I spent my evenings there after leaving my own courtroom, watching the grim, pathetic reality of my biological parents' lives come into excruciating focus. Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley hadn't just stumbled into financial hardship. They were the architects of their own perpetual misery. Eleanor's forensic autopsy of their finances revealed a textbook psychological profile of malignant narcissists. They were chronically drowning in debt, maxed out credit cards, predatory payday loans, and civil judgments. Yet, the records showed they never stopped taking luxury vacations, eating at expensive restaurants, or leasing cars they couldn't afford. They lived with an unshakable, arrogant belief that the universe owed them a luxurious life, and they were entirely comfortable stepping on anyone to get it. But it was on the 8th night of the investigation that Eleanor uncovered the first truly sickening twist of this entire ordeal. I was sitting at the conference table, rubbing my exhausted eyes, when Eleanor walked in. Her usually stoic face was uncharacteristically pale. She set a heavy binder on the desk in front of me. "I started digging into the period immediately following your abandonment," Eleanor said, her voice hushed. "Evangeline, they didn't just leave you at that mall to rid themselves of a financial burden. They monetized your disappearance." I opened the binder. Inside was a copy of a life insurance policy taken out in my name. "Less than a year after they walked away from you," Eleanor explained, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the dates. "Reginald filed a claim stating that his daughter had been abducted and was presumed dead. Because there was no body and the police had no leads, a grieving parent's settlement was reached. They collected $75,000. My stomach turned violently. I flipped to the next page, which showed bank withdrawals. They used the money from my supposed death to go to casinos and to buy a boat," Harrison added in disgust from the doorway. "But that's not the worst of it," Eleanor interrupted, tapping the binder. "That was just the beginning. Evangeline, when Arthur formally adopted you, he legally changed your name and secured a new social security number for you to ensure your past couldn't track you down. Your credit profile under Evangeline Bennett is spotless, but your original social security number, the one assigned to Evangeline Kingsley, was never officially deactivated in the broader credit bureaus." Eleanor pulled out a sprawling spreadsheet highlighted in neon yellow and slid it toward me. "For the last 30 years, your parents have been keeping the ghost of Evangeline Kingsley alive. They have been actively using your original social security number to open shadow credit cards, secure high-interest personal loans, and dodge creditors. There is currently over $250,000 in defaulted debt tied to your original name." The silence in the room was deafening. I felt a cold, prickling sweat break out across my skin. They hadn't just erased me, they had exploited my ghost. Every time they needed money, every time they maxed out their own limits, they resurrected the 5-year-old girl they left in a toy aisle, financially bleeding her dry, ruining a name I no longer used. They are facing federal wire fraud, identity theft, and insurance fraud charges if this comes to light, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous baritone. They didn't file this lawsuit just because they're greedy, Evangeline. They filed it because the walls are closing in. They are desperate. They need that $4 million to wipe their shadow ledgers clean before the FBI knocks on their door. This lawsuit isn't a plea for a lost daughter. It is an act of pure, calculated extortion. Armed with this horrifying knowledge, the lingering fear that had initially gripped me evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, surgical determination. I was going to destroy them in court, but the universe, it seemed, wasn't finished throwing ghosts into my path. A few days later, the late summer air was thick and humid as I left the courthouse. I was walking down the wide marble steps, my mind racing through legal precedents for prosecuting familial identity theft, when I noticed a woman standing near the bottom of the stairs. She was pacing nervously, clutching a canvas tote bag to her chest like a shield. As I walked closer, she stopped and turned toward me. My breath hitched in my throat. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was like looking into a distorted mirror. She was younger than me, perhaps in her early 30s, but she had my exact dark eyes. She had the same distinct slope of the jawline, and as a warm breeze blew past, she nervously tucked a stray strand of hair behind her left ear, a specific, unconscious nervous tic I had possessed my entire life. She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Evangeline?" My defensive instincts immediately flared. I tightened my grip on my briefcase. "Who are you?" Her voice trembled, barely louder than a whisper, yet it struck me with the force of a hurricane. "My name is Juliet. I'm your sister." The world seemed to tilt dangerously on its axis. A sister. 3 years after they discarded me, Reginald and Anastasia had simply started over. They had replaced me. Despite my overwhelming suspicion and the defensive walls I had spent decades building, something in Juliet's eyes, a profound, shattering, desperately lonely grief, made me agree to sit down with her. We walked in silence to a quiet, dimly lit coffee shop a few blocks away. We sat in a back booth, two strangers bound by blood and separated by a lifetime of unfathomable lies. Juliet wrapped her hands tightly around her mug, staring down at the dark liquid as if she couldn't bear to look at my face. She told me she was an elementary school teacher. She was soft-spoken, deeply empathetic, and radiated a quiet kindness that felt entirely at odds with the people who had raised her. "I grew up in a haunted house," Juliet began, her voice cracking under the weight of her words. "From the time I was old enough to understand language, I was told about my beautiful, tragic older sister. They told me you were stolen from a crowded mall when I was just a baby. They made me believe that our family was broken by an unimaginable tragedy. Every financial problem, every time my father drank too much and raged at the walls, every time my mother was cold and unreachable, it was always blamed on the unrelenting grief of losing you." She finally looked up, a single tear spilling over her lashes and tracking down her cheek. "I spent my entire life trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to make up for the massive hole you left in their hearts. I was the golden child, Evangeline, but I was always competing with a ghost, and I could never win." "Juliet, why are you here?" I asked gently, my heart breaking for the sheer psychological torture she had endured. She took a shaky breath, pressing a paper napkin against her eyes. "Because this whole lawsuit, the reason they found you, it's my fault." I leaned back, stunned. "What do you mean?" 3 weeks ago, Juliet whispered, I was sitting in my living room grading papers. The evening news was playing in the background, and then I heard the anchor mention the mall. I looked up and I saw your face on the screen. The story about the magistrate judge and the inheritance. I recognized your eyes immediately. They looked exactly like mine. Juliet's hands began to shake violently against the table. I panicked. I was so incredibly happy. I thought the nightmare was finally over. I drove straight to their house. I ran through the front door, crying, yelling that I had found you, that my sister was alive, that she was safe, that she was an honorable judge. I thought they were going to fall to their knees in relief. I thought we were finally going to be a real family. She choked on a sob, struggling to push the agonizing words past her lips. But they didn't. They just stared at me. My mother went completely pale like she had seen a monster, and my father looked terrified. They told me to go home. They told me to not say a single word to anyone. They said they needed time to process the shock. Juliet looked at me, her expression twisting in absolute agony. I knew something was wrong. I'm a teacher, Evangeline. I spend all day with kids. I know what a lie looks like. So I didn't go home. I pretended to pull out of the driveway, but I parked down the street. I crept around to their back patio and stood in the dark outside the kitchen window. The cafe around us faded away. It was just the two of us, sitting in the ruins of our shared history. I heard them, she cried softly. I heard my father say, if she remembers what we did, she'll ruin us. And my mother said, we have to strike first. We sue her for the estate. We claim the old man kidnapped her. We back her into a corner with the press until she pays us to go away. Juliet reached across the table, her trembling hand hovering over mine for a second, before pulling back, unsure if she was allowed to touch me. They didn't lose you, she whispered, the devastating realization echoing between us. They threw you away, and they used your memory to manipulate me for 28 years. My entire life, my entire childhood, was built on a calculated, monstrous lie. Looking at her, my anger toward Reginald and Anastasia multiplied 1,000 times over. They hadn't just destroyed my childhood, they had hollowed out hers. They had weaponized my absence to emotionally abuse and control the daughter they kept. Juliet wasn't my enemy. She wasn't an extension of them. She was a casualty of the exact same war. I reached across the table and firmly grasped her trembling hand. It's not your fault, Juliet, I said, my voice steady, anchoring her to the present. None of this is your fault. You were a victim too. Juliet let out a ragged, heavy breath, the tears falling freely now. We sat there for a long time, two sisters mourning the family we never had, mourning the parents we deserved but never got. But as the tears slowed, a profound shift happened in Juliet's posture. The devastated, betrayed daughter faded away, and a fierce, fiercely protective woman took her place. She wiped her face, her jaw setting with a newfound, unshakable resolve. They think I'm still their naive, obedient little girl, Juliet said, her voice dropping to a harsh, determined whisper. They think I'm blindly supporting their lawsuit. They have no idea I know the truth. She looked me dead in the eye. We shared the same fire. I want to help you, Juliet stated firmly. I will be your inside eyes. I will testify in open court. I will give your lawyers whatever they need. I am going to help you tear them down, Evangeline. I want the world to see exactly what they are. The weeks between that tearful, life-altering conversation in the coffee shop and the morning of the trial were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Reginald and Anastasia took their grand fiction straight to the local media. They sat on cheap daytime talk shows, holding hands, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes, and weaving a devastating tale of a family destroyed. Anastasia spoke of an empty bedroom she had supposedly kept pristine for 31 years, a bedroom I knew for a fact never existed. Reginald played the stoic, heartbroken patriarch, demanding that the corrupt system return what Arthur Bennett had allegedly stolen from them. They painted Arthur not as a savior, but as a wealthy predator who had exploited a moment of mall crowd confusion to abduct a child. It took every ounce of my judicial discipline not to hold a press conference of my own and scream the truth to the cameras. But Harrison Sterling advised against it. "Let them talk, Evangeline," Harrison said smoothly, standing by the window of our war room, watching a news segment of Anastasia weeping. "Let them build their glass house as high as they possibly can. It just means the shatter will be that much more spectacular when we throw the stone." And while they were busy performing for the cameras, Juliet was acting as our Trojan horse. She played her part flawlessly. She attended Sunday dinners at their house, nodding sympathetically as they bragged about how much money they were going to extract from my trust. But the moment she left their driveway, she drove straight to Harrison's office. She brought us photographs of past due notices, recorded conversations of them plotting to hide assets, and the horrifying confirmation that they were actively tracking the shadow credit cards they had opened under my original Social Security number. Juliet was the ultimate inside operative, fueled by the righteous anger of a daughter who realized her entire existence had been manipulated. Finally, the morning of the preliminary injunction hearing arrived. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, biting chill of late autumn. I didn't wear my black magistrate's robe. Today, I wasn't presiding over the law. I was relying on it to save my life and protect my father's legacy. I wore a tailored, charcoal gray suit, my hair pulled back sharply, my posture straight. When I walked up the wide marble steps of the courthouse, a building I walked into every single day, it felt entirely different. The press was waiting, cameras flashing like strobe lights, reporters shouting questions about my abduction. I ignored them all, walking through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. Reginald and Anastasia were already seated at the plaintiff's table. Their attorney, a man whose ill-fitting suit matched his theatrical, aggressive demeanor, was furiously whispering to them. Anastasia wore a muted, somber dress, clutching a tissue. Reginald sat rigid, his jaw set in feigned righteous indignation. They looked so incredibly confident. They truly believed this was going to be a simple, lucrative transaction. Shed a few tears, feign some trauma, and let the threat of a public scandal force me to hand over $4 million to erase their shadow debts. They didn't notice Juliet slipping quietly into the very back row of the gallery, her face pale but her posture resolute. The Honorable Judge Patricia Caldwell, a no-nonsense woman with 30 years on the bench, called the room to order. Because of my position as a magistrate, a judge from a neighboring district had been brought in to ensure absolute impartiality. The proceedings began with the Kingsley's attorney delivering his opening statement. It was a tragic, sickening fairy tale. He spoke of a crowded mall during the holiday rush, a moment of maternal distraction, and a wealthy, opportunistic man who had snatched a confused child to fulfill his own selfish desires. He demanded the immediate freezing of the Arthur Bennett Trust and petitioned for a massive settlement for 31 years of unimaginable emotional anguish and parental alienation. My clients have suffered the ultimate nightmare, the attorney concluded, his voice trembling with manufactured grief. They have lived with a hole in their hearts for 3 decades. We are simply asking this court to stop the distribution of these ill-gotten funds and return a semblance of justice to a family torn apart. He sat down, looking immensely proud of his performance. Anastasia let out a perfectly timed, muffled sob. Then, it was our turn. Harrison Sterling stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace the floor or pound his fists on the podium. He simply adjusted his glasses, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked directly at Judge Caldwell. "Your Honor," Harrison began, his voice a steady, commanding baritone that instantly commanded the room's respect. "The plaintiffs have built their entire petition on a foundation of profound, prolonged grief. They claim they searched, they claim they wept, but grief, Your Honor, leaves a paper trail. It leaves missing persons reports. It leaves frantic phone calls to the police. It leaves community search parties." Harrison slowly turned his gaze toward Reginald and Anastasia. The confident smirks on their faces began to falter. "We intend to show this court that Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley did not grieve. They profited. We intend to show that they did not lose their daughter in a crowd. They executed a calculated abandonment, and we will prove that this lawsuit is not a plea for a reunited family, but an act of desperate criminal extortion." The gallery murmured. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Proceed, Mr. Sterling." "The defense calls its first witness," Harrison announced. "Thomas Whitaker." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. An elderly man, his hair entirely white, dressed in his Sunday best, walked slowly down the center aisle. I felt a hard lump form in my throat. It was Thomas, the mall security guard who had wrapped his jacket around my shivering shoulders 31 years ago. Thomas took the oath and settled into the witness stand. His hands shook slightly, but his eyes were clear. He looked at me, offering a small, incredibly sad smile, before turning his attention to Harrison. Harrison quickly established Thomas's credentials as the head of mall security on that winter afternoon. He walked Thomas through the timeline, finding the terrified 5-year-old girl in the purple coat, bringing her to the security office, and reviewing the security tapes. "Mr. Whitaker," Harrison asked, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "did you personally interact with the plaintiffs, Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley, on the day in question?" "I did," Thomas said, his voice raspy but firm. "After we realized the little girl wasn't moving, I reviewed the live feeds. I saw the parents leaving the toy department without her. I radioed for backup and ran out to the parking lot. I caught them just as they were unlocking their car." Anastasia's face tightened into a rigid mask of panic. Reginald stared straight ahead, a muscle ticking violently in his jaw. "And what happened when you approached them?" Harrison asked. "Did you ask them if they had forgotten their child?" Thomas gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand, his knuckles turning white. He took a deep, shaky breath, preparing to release a toxic secret that had poisoned his conscience for over 3 decades. "I ran up to the car, out of breath," Thomas testified, the entire courtroom hanging on his every word. "I said, Ma'am, sir, did you leave a little girl inside? She's wearing a purple coat. The mother, Anastasia, she wouldn't even look at me. She just stared at the dashboard and shook her head. She said, "No, we don't have a kid." "And the father?" Harrison pressed. Reginald stepped away from the car door. He walked right up to me, stepping into my personal space, Thomas said, a tear finally spilling down his weathered cheek. He reached into his wallet. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and he shoved it straight into the front pocket of my uniform jacket. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. The reporters in the front row began scribbling furiously. Judge Caldwell lowered her reading glasses, staring at Reginald with a look of absolute disgust. "What did he say to you when he handed you the money, Mr. Whitaker?" Harrison asked gently. Thomas swallowed hard, his voice cracking under the weight of a 31-year-old regret. He looked me dead in the eye and he said, "Look the other way, buddy. The kid is sick. We can't afford her anymore. Consider this a tip for forgetting you saw us." The courtroom erupted. "Objection!" The Kingsley's attorney shouted, leaping to his feet, his face red with panic. "Hearsay! This is an outrageous, unsubstantiated fabrication." "Overruled!" Judge Caldwell barked, slamming her gavel so hard the sound cracked like a whip. "The witness is testifying to a direct, first-hand conversation. Sit down, counselor." The attorney sank back into his chair, looking like a man who had just realized he was standing on the deck of a sinking ship. "I was a young man," Thomas choked out, turning his tear-filled eyes toward Judge Caldwell. "I was drowning in medical bills for my own wife's cancer treatments. We were about to lose our house. I was terrified, and I was broke. I took the money. I put my hands in my pockets, and I let them drive away. I let them leave their little girl behind." Thomas looked over at me, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "I have lived with that agonizing shame every single day of my life. I watched the news. I watched them lie. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. They didn't lose her. They threw her away, and they bribed me to let them do it." Reginald shot up from his chair, his face contorted in a violent, terrifying rage that I remembered all too well from my childhood. "He's lying! He's a senile old fool! This is a setup! You're paying him to say this!" "Bailiff, restrain the plaintiff!" Judge Caldwell roared. Two armed bailiffs immediately stepped forward, placing their hands heavily on Reginald's shoulders, forcing him back into his seat. The outburst had done exactly what Harrison wanted. It had shown the judge the monster hiding beneath the grieving father's suit. Harrison waited for the murmurs in the gallery to die down. He walked back to the defense table, his eyes locked on Reginald and Anastasia, who were now hyperventilating, their arrogant facades completely shattered. But Harrison Sterling wasn't even close to being done. He hadn't even dropped the heaviest bomb. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. The defense has no further questions for this witness," Harrison said smoothly. He turned to face the gallery, his voice ringing out with lethal clarity. "Your Honor, to further prove the malicious, fraudulent intent of this lawsuit, the defense calls its next witness to the stand." Harrison paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. "We call Juliet Kingsley." If Thomas Whitaker's testimony was a spark, Juliet's name was a stick of dynamite. Reginald and Anastasia whipped their heads around, their eyes wide with absolute paralyzing horror. From the very back row of the courtroom, their youngest daughter, their golden child, the one they had manipulated for 28 years, stood up. She smoothed the front of her dress, lifted her chin, and began to walk calmly down the center aisle straight toward the witness stand. She didn't look at her parents. She looked only at me. And in her eyes, I saw the exact same unyielding fire that burned in mine. It was time to finish this. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung shut, sealing the room in a thick, electrified silence. Every single eye in the gallery, the jury box, and the press row turned to watch Juliet Kingsley walk down the center aisle. "Juliet, what on earth are you doing?" Anastasia hissed. It was a venomous, frantic whisper, sharp enough to cut glass, yet it carried perfectly across the dead, silent room. Anastasia's carefully constructed mask of the grieving, frail mother was slipping, revealing the terrified, controlling manipulator underneath. Reginald reached out, trying to grab Juliet's wrist as she passed their table. "Sit down immediately," he ordered through clenched teeth. Juliet didn't even flinch. She gracefully sidestepped his grasp, refusing to cast even a fleeting glance in their direction. She kept her eyes locked entirely on me. Her posture was straight, her chin held high, radiating a quiet, unshakable courage that made my chest swell with a fierce, protective pride. This was the sister I had never known I had, standing up to the monsters who had terrorized us both. She stepped up into the witness box, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the whole truth. Harrison Sterling approached the podium, his demeanor calm and respectful, a stark contrast to the chaotic panic radiating from the plaintiff's table. "Please state your name for the record," Harrison said softly. "Juliet Marie Kingsley," she replied. Her voice trembled just a fraction on the first syllable, but she quickly steadied herself. "Ms. Kingsley, what is your relationship to the plaintiffs, Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley, and the defendant, Evangeline Bennett?" "Reginald and Anastasia are my biological parents," Juliet stated clearly, "and Evangeline is my older sister. The sister they told me had been stolen from a crowded mall when I was just a baby." Harrison nodded slowly, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. "How long did you believe that story, Miss Kingsley?" "My entire life," Juliet answered, her eyes welling with tears that she stubbornly refused to let fall. "I am 28 years old, and for 28 years I grew up in a haunted house. I was raised on the tragedy of a kidnapped sister. Every financial failure, every burst of my father's terrible temper, every moment of my mother's cold, emotional distance. It was always blamed on the unrelenting grief of losing Evangeline. I spent my childhood trying to be perfect, trying to make up for a ghost they claimed was violently ripped from our family." The gallery was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Judge Caldwell watched Juliet with a deeply empathetic, calculating gaze. "When did you realize that your parents' narrative was a fabrication?" Harrison asked gently. 3 weeks ago," Juliet said. "I was at my apartment, grading papers. I'm an elementary school teacher. The evening news was playing on my television, and the anchor began talking about a local magistrate judge who had inherited a massive estate from her adoptive father. They showed Evangeline's face on the screen." Juliet looked over at me, a sad, beautiful smile touching the corners of her lips. I recognized her eyes immediately. They are my eyes. I panicked, but it was a panic born of pure, overwhelming joy. I thought the nightmare of my childhood was finally over. I thought my family was whole again. She gripped the edge of the wooden witness box. I drove straight to my parents' house. I ran through their front door, crying, telling them I had found her, that my sister was alive, that she was safe, and that she was a highly respected judge. I expected them to fall to their knees in relief. I expected them to grab their coats and rush to the courthouse to find her. "And what was their actual reaction?" Harrison pressed, leaning forward. Juliet's expression hardened, the sorrow replaced by a cold, righteous anger. "They stared at me in absolute horror. My mother went completely pale, and my father looked terrified. They ordered me to go home and forbade me from speaking a single word of this to anyone. They said they needed time to process the shock." She took a deep breath, her voice rising with unwavering authority. "But I spend all day with children, Mr. Sterling. I know exactly what a guilty lie looks like. I didn't go home. I pretended to leave, but I parked down the street. I crept through their backyard and stood on the dark patio right outside their open kitchen window, and I listened." "Did you record what you heard, Miss Kingsley?" Harrison asked. "I did, on my phone," Juliet confirmed. Harrison walked over to the bailiff and handed over a small silver flash drive. "Your Honor, Defense Exhibit D, an audio recording captured by the witness, which has been legally authenticated and submitted into discovery." The Kingsley's attorney practically vaulted out of his chair. "Objection, Your Honor, this is a flagrant violation of privacy. This is an unauthorized recording of a private conversation in a private residence." "Your Honor," Harrison countered smoothly, "the state operates under a one-party consent law for recordings, provided the recording party is present and the conversation can be easily overheard from a public or accessible space without electronic enhancement. Ms. Kingsley was standing in an unfenced yard listening to a conversation taking place next to an open window. The precedent is clear. It is admissible." Judge Caldwell glared at the frantic attorney. "Overruled. Play the audio." The bailiff clicked a button on a laptop. The courtroom speakers crackled to life. The audio was slightly muffled by the outdoor breeze, but the voices were unmistakable. "If she remembers what we did, she'll ruin us." Reginald's recorded voice echoed through the courtroom, laced with raw, undeniable panic. "Calm down and think," Anastasia's voice replied. It wasn't the voice of a weeping mother. It was the cold, calculating tone of a predator. "We have to strike first. We sue her for the estate. We claim the old man kidnapped her. We back her into a corner with the press. She's a judge. She has a reputation to protect. She'll pay us to go away just to keep it quiet." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the sound of a 31-year-old lie shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The reporters in the front row were staring at Reginald and Anastasia with open disgust. The Kingsleys' attorney slowly sat back down, sliding his legal pad away from him. He closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose, the posture of a man who knew his career was actively imploding by association. "They did not love Evangeline," Juliet stated clearly into the microphone, delivering the final, crushing blow. "They used her memory to manipulate me my entire life, and they filed this lawsuit to extort her." "Thank you, Miss Kingsley. Your bravery is commendable," Harrison said softly. He didn't even bother looking at the opposing counsel for cross-examination. The man waved his hand weakly, declining to ask Juliet a single question. There was no defense against your own recorded voice. Juliet stepped down from the stand, walked directly to the defense table, and took a seat right behind me. I reached back, finding her hand and squeezing it tightly. But Harrison wasn't finished. We hadn't just come to prove they were liars. We came to prove they were criminals. "Your Honor," Harrison announced, pacing back to the center of the room. The recording clearly demonstrates an intent to extort, but extortion requires a motive. Why were the plaintiffs so desperate for $4 million that they were willing to commit perjury? To answer that, the defense calls Eleanor Vance. Eleanor walked into the courtroom with the clinical, lethal precision of a surgeon stepping into an operating room. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, carrying a thick binder of financial documents, she took the stand. Harrison swiftly established her credentials as a premier forensic accountant. "Ms. Vance, did you conduct a comprehensive audit of Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley's finances over the last 31 years?" "I did," Eleanor replied, her voice cool and analytical. "And the findings reveal a prolonged, systematic pattern of severe financial fraud." Harrison turned on the projector, displaying a document onto the large screen next to the jury box. "Let's start with the year following Evangeline's abandonment," Harrison prompted. "Less than 12 months after leaving their daughter at the mall," Eleanor explained, using a laser pointer, "Reginald Kingsley filed a claim on a life insurance policy he had taken out on Evangeline. Despite having no physical evidence, he successfully petitioned to have her legally presumed dead due to abduction. The insurance company paid out a grieving parent's settlement of $75,000. The judge's jaw actually dropped. "They collected life insurance on the child they abandoned?" "Yes, Your Honor," Eleanor confirmed. "And my tracking of those funds shows they were not used for memorial services or private investigators. The money was exhausted within 18 months on luxury car leases, high-end restaurant dining, and significant withdrawals at 3 separate casinos." Reginald slumped in his chair, his face entirely drained of color. Anastasia was staring blankly at the table, her hands trembling violently. "But the insurance fraud was merely the beginning, wasn't it, Ms. Vance?" Harrison pressed, guiding the execution. "It was," Eleanor said, flipping to the next tab in her binder. Another spreadsheet appeared on the screen, highlighted in glaring neon yellow. "When Arthur Bennett legally adopted Evangeline, he secured a new Social Security number for her safety. However, her original Social Security number, the one issued at her birth, remained in the system." Eleanor looked directly at the judge. For the past 3 decades, Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley have actively maintained the financial ghost of Evangeline Kingsley. They have used her original Social Security number to open dozens of shadow credit cards, secure high-interest personal loans, and lease vehicles they otherwise could not afford. Whenever their own credit maxed out, they simply stole their abandoned daughter's identity. "And what is the current balance of that fraudulent debt?" Harrison asked. "As of this morning," Eleanor stated, "there is over $250,000 in defaulted debt tied to Evangeline's original name. The plaintiffs are currently facing imminent foreclosure, vehicle repossession, and civil lawsuits from aggressive creditors. They are financially drowning. They needed this $4 million estate not to heal a broken family, but to wipe their shadow ledgers clean before federal investigators caught wind of the identity theft." The sheer magnitude of their depravity hung heavy in the courtroom air. They hadn't just discarded me. They had fed off my corpse for 31 years. Judge Caldwell removed her reading glasses, her hands shaking with a rare, barely contained judicial fury. She looked down at Reginald and Anastasia, who were now completely silent, staring into the abyss of their own making. "Counselor," Judge Caldwell said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register as she addressed the Kingsley's attorney. I highly suggest you advise your clients of their Fifth Amendment rights, because as of this moment, this is no longer just a civil probate dispute. I am officially referring this matter and all evidence presented today to the federal prosecutor's office for immediate investigation into wire fraud, identity theft, and extortion. She slammed her gavel down, the sound ringing out like a gunshot. This court is in recess for 1 hour to review the motions for dismissal. Court dismissed. As the gallery erupted into chaotic chatter and reporters sprinted for the doors to file their breaking stories, I stood up. My legs felt slightly weak, but my spine was made of steel. The nightmare was over. The monsters had finally been dragged into the light. I walked out of the courtroom with Juliet and Harrison, stepping into the quiet, marble-lined hallway to catch my breath. The air felt lighter. I felt 31 years of invisible weight lifting off my chest. But as we stood there, savoring the absolute destruction of their lives, a quiet, elegantly dressed older woman approached us. She wore a tailored beige coat, her silver hair pulled back into a neat twist. She held a small, polished wooden lockbox tightly against her chest. I recognized her vaguely from my teenage years. It was Margaret Holloway. She was a woman Arthur had briefly dated and loved deeply, though she had left our lives because she hadn't felt ready to help raise a traumatized, grieving child. Evangeline, Margaret said softly, her eyes filled with profound respect, heavy regret, and a deep, overwhelming sadness. Margaret, what are you doing here? I asked, completely caught off guard. She took a step closer, holding out the wooden box with trembling hands. Arthur gave me this box years ago, long before he got sick. He made me promise to keep it safe. He told me to only give it to you if the ghosts of your past ever came knocking at your door. And she looked back toward the closed courtroom doors, then back at me. You think you know everything they did to you, Margaret whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. But Arthur took one last secret to his grave to protect you. I think it's finally time you open the box. The marble hallway outside the courtroom was cool and quiet, a jarring contrast to the explosive, life-altering chaos we had just left behind. I stood there, my heart pounding an erratic rhythm against my ribs, staring at the polished wooden lockbox in Margaret Holloway's trembling hands. What do you mean, Arthur took a secret to his grave? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret took a shaky breath, her eyes brimming with a profound, heavy sorrow. She was a woman who had spent decades living with the regret of walking away from a good man because she had been too afraid of the baggage he carried, namely, me. When Arthur first brought you home, I loved him, Margaret said softly, her gaze dropping to the floor. But you were so broken, Evangeline. You woke up screaming every night. You wouldn't speak. You hoarded food in your pockets because you were terrified you would be starved. I watched Arthur pour every ounce of his soul into putting you back together, and I was a coward. I told him it was too much. I told him he was sacrificing his golden years for a child who wasn't even his. She looked up at me, a single tear cutting a path through her carefully applied makeup. Do you know what he said to me? She whispered. He looked me dead in the eye and said, She is not a sacrifice, Margaret. She is my salvation. And if you cannot see the absolute miracle of this child, then you cannot be in my life. A sob caught in my throat. Even before I could fully understand what love was, Arthur had been fiercely, unapologetically choosing me. I walked away, Margaret continued, wiping her cheek. But years later, before his diagnosis, he called me. We met for coffee. He handed me this box. He told me that he had spent his life shielding you from the monsters in your past, but he knew that if he died, they might try to use the legal system to rewrite history. He told me to give this to you only if they ever dared to show their faces again. She pressed the heavy wooden box into my hands. I am so sorry, Evangeline, for leaving, but I am so incredibly proud of the woman you became. Arthur was right, you were a miracle. Margaret gave me a sudden fleeting smile, turned on her heel, and walked away down the long corridor, her heels clicking softly against the marble. I looked down at the box. Harrison Sterling and Juliet stood silently on either side of me, offering their quiet, unwavering support. With trembling fingers, I undid the brass clasp and lifted the lid. Inside lay a worn, leather-bound journal. I recognized Arthur's neat, architectural handwriting immediately. But tucked beneath the journal was a folded, yellowing legal document bearing the heavy, embossed seal of the State Family Court. I pulled it out and carefully unfolded the fragile paper. I read the title at the top of the page, and the air completely left my lungs. Voluntary Relinquishment of Parental Rights and Consent to Adoption. What is it? Juliet asked, leaning over my shoulder, her voice thick with worry. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, tracking down to the bottom of the page. There, in stark, undeniable black ink, were the signatures of Reginald Kingsley and Anastasia Kingsley. The document was dated exactly 1 year after the winter afternoon they had abandoned me in the toy aisle. They knew! I gasped, the revelation hitting me with the force of a physical blow. They always knew where I was. Harrison gently took the document from my shaking hands, his seasoned eyes quickly absorbing the legal text. His jaw tightened in absolute, unadulterated disgust. "Evangeline," Harrison said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "This is a plea deal." "A plea deal?" Juliet asked, her eyes wide with confusion. "1 year after you were abandoned, the police must have finally tracked them down," Harrison explained, pointing to a specific clause in the paperwork. They were facing felony charges for child abandonment and reckless endangerment. They were looking at real prison time. To avoid going to jail, they struck a quiet deal with the state and with Arthur's legal team. In exchange for the criminal charges being dropped, they voluntarily and permanently signed away all of their parental rights, allowing Arthur's adoption to proceed unhindered. The marble hallway seemed to spin around me. They knew I was safe. They knew a wealthy, kind man had taken me in. They signed the papers to save their own skin, walked out of a courtroom entirely free, and went home to play the victims. They spent the next 3 decades looking into Juliet's eyes, telling her a tragic, tear-soaked fairy tale about a stolen child, all while knowing exactly who had me. "They perjured themselves," Harrison said, a slow, lethal smile spreading across his face. "In their initial filing for this lawsuit, they swore under oath that they never stopped looking for you. They swore they never consented to the adoption. They just handed us the final nail for their coffin." The heavy oak doors of the courtroom suddenly swung open. The bailiff stepped out. "Counselors, the judge is ready to resume." I looked at Juliet. The last shred of lingering daughterly guilt had completely vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. I looked at Harrison, who was carefully sliding the relinquishment document into his legal portfolio. "Let's go end this," I said. We walked back into the courtroom. The air was thick with tension. Reginald and Anastasia sat at their table, looking noticeably paler than before the recess. Their attorney looked physically ill, staring at his legal pad as if wishing it would swallow him whole. Judge Caldwell took the bench, her expression carved from stone. "Before I rule on the defense's motion to dismiss based on the overwhelming evidence of financial fraud and extortion, does the plaintiff have any final remarks?" The Kingsley's attorney stood up slowly. "Your Honor, my clients maintain that they were acting out of a place of profound emotional distress." "Save it, counselor," Harrison interrupted, standing tall. "Your Honor, during the recess, newly discovered, highly relevant documentary evidence was brought to the defense's attention. We request permission to submit Defense Exhibit E." Judge Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "Proceed, Mr. Sterling." Harrison walked to the bench and handed the yellowing legal document to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. Harrison then turned, walking slowly back to our table, his eyes locked on Reginald and Anastasia. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs have built this entire lawsuit on the sworn, notarized claim that Evangeline Bennett was abducted, that they searched for her tirelessly, and that they never consented to her adoption by Arthur Bennett." Harrison's voice rang out, filling every corner of the silent room. "They swore to this under penalty of perjury." Judge Caldwell was reading the document. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her face, replaced by a flush of absolute, unbridled judicial rage. "What you are holding, Your Honor," Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register, "is a voluntary relinquishment of parental rights, signed by both Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley, dated 1 year after the abandonment. They were facing felony child endangerment charges. They signed away their daughter to Arthur Bennett to avoid going to prison. They knew exactly where she was. They knew she was safe, and they lied to this court." The courtroom erupted. Reporters gasped aloud. Reginald shot up from his chair. "That's a forgery. We never signed that. We were coerced." "Mr. Kingsley, sit down and shut your mouth," Judge Caldwell roared, her voice echoing like thunder. She didn't use her gavel. She didn't need to. The sheer, terrifying authority in her voice froze Reginald in his tracks. He sank back into his chair, trembling. Anastasia buried her face in her hands, letting out a genuine, terrified sob. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen. Judge Caldwell took off her glasses and looked down at the plaintiffs with a level of disgust I had rarely seen on the bench. "I have sat in this courtroom for 3 decades. Judge Caldwell began, her voice shaking with righteous fury. "I have presided over tragedies, accidents, and moments of profound human failing, but I have rarely, if ever, encountered a level of sheer, malignant depravity like the one sitting at the plaintiff's table today." She leaned forward, her piercing gaze pinning Reginald and Anastasia to their seats. "You did not lose a child. You threw her away like garbage, and when you were caught, you traded her for your own freedom. You spent 30 years financially bleeding her ghost dry, emotionally abusing your remaining daughter with a fabricated tragedy, and then you had the sheer, breathtaking audacity to walk into my courtroom and attempt to extort the legacy of the man who saved her from you." Judge Caldwell picked up her pen. "The plaintiff's petition is dismissed with prejudice. You will never be allowed to bring this claim or any claim resembling it in any court in this country ever again." She pointed her pen directly at their attorney. "Counselor, I am officially referring your clients to the United States Attorney's Office. I am recommending immediate federal indictments for perjury, wire fraud, identity theft, and extortion. They will not see a dime of Arthur Bennett's estate, but they will very likely see the inside of a federal penitentiary." The gavel slammed down. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. But as the gallery broke into chaotic, shocked chatter, Harrison Sterling did not sit down. He calmly reached into his briefcase and pulled out a fresh, newly bound stack of legal paperwork. He walked directly over to the plaintiff's table. Reginald and Anastasia were staring blankly at the wood grain, shell-shocked, realizing their lives were effectively over. Harrison dropped the heavy stack of papers right in front of them. The thud made Anastasia flinch. "What is this?" their attorney stammered, his face ghostly white. "That," Harrison said, a terrifyingly polite smile on his face, "is a civil lawsuit. On behalf of Evangeline Bennett, we are suing Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley for identity theft, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." Harrison leaned over the table, his eyes locking onto Reginald's. "We have already filed emergency injunctions with the civil courts. As of 10 minutes ago, all of your bank accounts have been frozen. Your wages will be garnished. We are placing a lien on your home, your vehicles, and any asset you currently possess to pay off the $250,000 in shadow debt you accrued in my client's name." Reginald's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. "You came here to steal Arthur's money," Harrison whispered, his voice cold as ice. "Instead, the law is going to take absolutely everything you have left. Have a wonderful afternoon." Harrison turned his back on them and walked back to our table. I stood up. I looked at the two people who had brought me into the world, who had broken my heart and who had tried to destroy my life. They looked so small now, so pathetic. The terrifying monsters of my childhood had been reduced to nothing more than shivering, bankrupt criminals. I didn't say a word to them. I didn't need to. I turned to Juliet, who was wiping tears of absolute profound relief from her eyes. I held out my hand to her. She took it, gripping it tightly. Together, we walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, our heads held high, leaving the ghosts of our past exactly where they belonged, in the ruins of their own making. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse closed behind us with a resounding final thud. When Juliet and I stepped out onto the wide marble steps and into the crisp, late autumn air, the world felt fundamentally different. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had shadowed me since I was a 5-year-old girl shivering in a purple coat had finally, permanently evaporated. The media storm that followed the dismissal of the lawsuit was absolute and merciless. The press, who had initially flocked to the story hoping for a heartwarming tale of a reunited family, instead broadcast the spectacular criminal downfall of Reginald and Anastasia Kingsley. The audio recording Juliet had captured, combined with the staggering evidence of identity theft and the 31-year-old relinquishment document, became the focal point of a national outrage. There was no quiet retreat for them. There was no fading back into obscurity. Within weeks, the United States Attorney's Office handed down federal indictments. Reginald and Anastasia were arrested on charges of wire fraud, insurance fraud, aggravated identity theft, and perjury. The civil injunctions Harrison Sterling had so flawlessly executed acted as a financial guillotine. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their heavily mortgaged house was seized to satisfy the massive, fraudulent debts they had accrued under my name. The luxury cars they had leased with stolen credit were towed right out of their driveway while news helicopters hovered overhead. They were left with absolutely nothing. No money, no home, no reputation, and no family. I watched the news coverage of their arrest from the quiet safety of my living room, sipping a cup of tea. I didn't feel a shred of pity. I didn't feel triumphant either. I just felt a profound settling sense of closure. They had finally been forced to pay the tab they had been running from their entire lives. The monsters under my bed had been dragged into the daylight, and it turned out they were nothing more than pathetic, greedy cowards. But as the dust settled on their destruction, something incredibly beautiful began to grow in the space they left behind. Juliet officially moved out of her small apartment and temporarily into the guest room of my house. Those first few months were a delicate, beautiful dance of two strangers learning how to be sisters. We spent countless evenings sitting on my back porch, wrapped in thick blankets, talking late into the night. We compared our childhoods, the stark, quiet safety of my life with Arthur, and the chaotic, emotionally starved reality of her life with our biological parents. We cried together. We laughed at the eerie, undeniable similarities we shared. Our mutual hatred of black licorice, our tendency to pace when we were thinking, the exact same crooked smile that appeared when we were being sarcastic. We were stitching a family together, not from the obligations of blood, but from a foundation of chosen truth and mutual survival. I spent 28 years trying to earn their love, Juliet whispered to me one night, staring up at the stars. I thought if I was just a little bit better, a little bit quieter, a little bit smarter, they would finally stop grieving the ghost of you and look at me. I reached over and took her hand. You never had to earn anything, Juliet. They were broken long before you were born. But we aren't. We survived them. With the lawsuit dismissed and my inheritance finally secure, I requested a 6-month sabbatical from my position on the bench. Arthur had left me $4 million and a directive to build the life I deserved, insulated from the cruelty of my beginnings. But the more I thought about his legacy, the more I realized that simply living comfortably in a larger house or taking expensive vacations wasn't what he meant. Arthur didn't just give me wealth, he gave me a blueprint on how to save a life. And I knew exactly what I needed to do. I purchased a massive abandoned brick community center in the heart of the city. For months, Juliet and I poured every ounce of our energy into renovating it. We hired contractors to tear down the sterile institutional walls and replace them with warm, inviting spaces. We built a vast library, private counseling offices, and emergency residential suites. I hired Harrison Sterling's firm to manage the legal structuring, and I brought Eleanor Vance on board to oversee the financial endowments to ensure the money would last for generations. When the frost of winter finally melted away, giving birth to a brilliant, blooming spring, we stood outside the newly painted double doors for the grand opening. A heavy brass plaque was bolted to the brick wall. It read, "The Arthur Bennett Foundation, a safe haven for foster and abandoned children." The crowd that gathered for the ribbon cutting was incredible. There were local social workers, pediatricians, child advocates, and members of the press who had followed our story from the courtroom to this triumphant conclusion. Harrison stood near the front, beaming with pride. Margaret Holloway, Arthur's former love, was there too, holding a bouquet of bright yellow tulips. And sitting in the front row as an honored guest wearing a brand new suit was Thomas Whitaker. The elderly security guard who had wrapped his jacket around a terrified 5-year-old girl in a toy aisle had been given a permanent seat on the foundation's advisory board. He had finally forgiven himself for the mistake he made in his youth, finding his redemption in helping us protect the future. Juliet stood beside me on the small wooden stage. She had formally resigned from her public school teaching job to become the foundation's full-time director of education and child welfare. She looked radiant, completely free of the ghosts that had haunted her youth. I stepped up to the microphone. The spring breeze gently tugged at my hair. 31 years ago, I began, my voice steady, carrying over the silent crowd. I stood in a crowded shopping mall, completely alone. The people who were supposed to protect me walked away without looking back. I believed in the quiet, terrifying logic of a child that I was invisible, that I was unlovable, that I was a burden. I looked down at the brass plaque bearing Arthur's name, but a man named Arthur Bennett saw me. He didn't see a burden, he saw a daughter. He taught me that family is not defined by the blood in your veins, but by the people who choose to stay when it would be easier to walk away. He spent his life building a fortress of love around me, so that the cruelty of my beginnings could not dictate the trajectory of my end. I looked out at the faces in the crowd, my heart swelling with an overwhelming, profound gratitude. This foundation exists for the children who are still standing in the metaphorical toy aisles of the world, counting the seconds, waiting for someone to come back for them. We are here to tell them that they are seen, that they are inherently worthy of love, and that no matter who walked away from them, their story is not over. It is only just beginning. The applause that followed was deafening, a roaring wave of hope and triumph. We cut the ribbon, and the doors of the Arthur Bennett Foundation officially opened to the world. Later that afternoon, as the crowd began to thin and the caterers packed up their tables, I was standing in the main lobby, talking quietly with Juliet. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the large glass windows, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floor. Suddenly, the front door opened. A police officer walked in, looking exhausted but relieved. Holding his hand was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Years. She was wearing a faded, oversized jacket, and she was clutching a small, incredibly dirty stuffed bear tightly to her chest. Her large, dark eyes darted around the room, wide with a familiar, paralyzing terror. The officer caught my eye. "Social services is entirely backed up tonight," he said softly, looking down at the girl. "They told me you had emergency intake beds. She was found wandering a few blocks from here. No one has come looking for her." The lobby went perfectly still. I looked at the little girl. I didn't see a stranger. I saw myself. I saw the fear, the confusion, the silent, desperate plea to be invisible so the world couldn't hurt her anymore. I handed my clipboard to Juliet, who gave me a knowing, tearful nod. I walked slowly across the lobby. I didn't tower over her. I knelt down on the hardwood floor so that I was perfectly at her eye level. I kept my hands resting gently on my own knees, ensuring she didn't feel trapped. She stared at me, her grip tightening on her stuffed bear. She was shivering, even though it was warm inside. "Hi there," I said, my voice dropping to a soft, steady whisper. She didn't speak. She just blinked, a single tear cutting a path through the dirt on her cheek. "I know it's really scary right now," I said gently. "I know there are a lot of people, and everything feels really big and really loud, but I promise you, you are incredibly safe here. No one is going to rush you. No one is going to make you do anything you don't want to do." I smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached all the way to my eyes. "My name is Evangeline," I said softly. "Are you cold? Would you like a cup of hot chocolate?" The little girl looked at me for a long, quiet moment, and then, ever so slowly, she nodded her head. I held out my hand. She hesitated for a second, and then her tiny, trembling fingers reached out and wrapped around mine. As I stood up and walked her gently toward the kitchen, I looked up at the ceiling, offering a silent, deeply grateful prayer to the man who had taught me how to save a life. The cycle of trauma had finally been broken, and a new cycle, one of fierce, unconditional love, had officially begun. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If Evangeline and Juliet's journey of surviving abandonment, fighting for the truth, and turning pain into a legacy of power resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and join our community. Drop a comment below and let me know which moment moved you the most. Your support allows me to keep sharing stories of resilience, justice, and the unbreakable strength of women. Until next time, stay strong, and remember, your past does not dictate your power.